Tonight we embark on a chilling journey into the middle of nowhere, a destination shadowed by eerie tales and dark whispers. But before we dive in, let's take a moment to get comfortable. A very happy birthday to Logan. Here's hoping your night is far less unsettling than the one we're about to recount. So settle in, turn off the lights, and let the shadows take hold. I was 15 when this happened, living in a small southern town situated along the historic Natchez Trace. For those unfamiliar, the Natchez Trace is a vast stretch of road running nearly the entire length of the United States from north to south. Originally used by Native American tribes for trade, it also served as a strategic travel route for soldiers on both sides during the Civil War. Today, it's federally protected land, remote and undisturbed. Regulations prohibit any construction within roughly a mile of the trail, leaving it largely untouched, with almost no streetlights and only a simple two-lane road cutting through the wilderness. The area is steeped in history, home to burial mounds, unnamed Civil War graves, and countless offshoot trails that wind through dense woods. Digging or disturbing anything is strictly forbidden, and over time stories began to circulate about strange occurrences and violent incidents. I still remember hearing about a young woman who was murdered there in the 90s, which gave rise to plenty of warnings about avoiding the trail after dark. Growing up near the trace, hiking became a frequent pastime for me and my friends. Its innate beauty drew us in, and whenever we strayed off the main path, we discovered hidden treasures, old artifacts or forgotten pockets of wilderness that felt like secret worlds. One particular day remains etched in my memory. Though not for its charm or discovery, it was springtime on the cusp of summer, with longer days teasing us to venture farther than usual. We'd been hiking for a couple of hours and decided to veer off trail once again, chasing our curiosity through narrow wooded paths as dusk began to settle. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon a clearing, a sprawling field dotted with overgrown grass and shadows stretched wide. At first glance it seemed untouched, but then we noticed an old truck resting in the middle of the field. Something about its presence immediately put us on edge. Vehicles weren't allowed out there. The area was too remote and regulated for anyone to be driving legally. Worse still were the two men next to the truck, shovels in hand and surrounded by mounds of freshly dug dirt. Their demeanor suggested they'd been at work for hours. None of this felt right, especially when they noticed us standing at the tree line. For a brief second, everything seemed suspended, the silence between us heavy with tension. Then chaos broke loose. The men bolted for their truck, started it up, and charged toward us at full speed. Panic set in instantly. We sprinted into the trees without a second thought, hearts pounding as branches slapped against our arms and faces. I'll never forget the sound of that truck's engine cutting off behind us or the angry shouts of the men as they gave chase. We didn't stop running until we stumbled on a deadfall, a cluster of broken trees, and quickly buried ourselves within it. Trying to become invisible, my pulse was deafening as I strained to hear their movements through the thick underbrush. Their voices grew nearer, joined by the low sound of dogs barking. They had brought hounds, which only intensified our fear. One man shouted above the commotion, "I can't see you, but I can hear you. My dog's going to find you." We stayed frozen beneath the fallen limbs, barely daring to breathe as their threats echoed around us. Minutes crawled by like hours until their voices grew fainter and eventually disappeared altogether. The truck roared to life once more somewhere deeper in the distance, fading as it drove off. Only after complete silence returned did we creep toward our car, hearts still racing. That drive home was unforgettable. Every pair of headlights we passed seemed like theirs, coming back for us. We responded with nervous glances and an overwhelming sense of dread. To this day, I still don't know what those men were doing out there, or why they reacted so violently upon seeing us, but whatever it was couldn't have been good. When I was younger, my imagination leapt immediately to sinister scenarios, perhaps burying a body in such an isolated spot where no one would think to look. As I grew older, though, more practical theories came to mind. Drug stashes or illegal dealings that they didn't want stumbled upon. Regardless of their true motives, I never went back to that part of the trace again. That encounter reminded me just how unsettling even the most serene places can become once darkness and danger seep into their shadows. The town I grew up in was small, So small that I've often wondered if I've unknowingly crossed paths with the same people from my past while running errands or sitting just a car or two behind them at a stoplight. The thought still sends a shiver down my spine. One memory in particular has haunted me for over 5 decades. The year was 1974, and I was only 11 years old. A friend and I were walking home from the River Waverley near Balby in Suffolk, UK. We lived in a quaint little village called Barley, tucked away in the countryside, a remote area with sparse signs of civilization. That day we decided to take a familiar shortcut along a bridle path near the railway line, surrounded by thick woods. As we wandered, we noticed a clearing ahead. Smoke rose from what we first assumed to be a bonfire. Curious, we approached and were stunned to see a white wooden Victorian-style house with a smoking chimney. In the yard there were 2 children playing, a boy and a girl, and an older woman sitting on the porch. They all wore clothing that seemed straight out of the Victorian era, long flowing dresses for the women, and a cloth cap on an older man who was chopping wood out front. The scene felt distinctly out of time. We leaned on the wooden fence, watching this strange family for what must have only been minutes, though it felt much longer. I vividly recall murmuring to my friend that no one lived in this spot. We'd taken this path before and would have remembered such a house. The children eventually noticed us and began walking in our direction. The man chopping wood called out for them to stop, his voice stern but calm. He then turned to us, gripping his axe, not menacingly but firmly, and told us to leave. Fear gripped us like ice-cold chains. Without looking back, we bolted down the path toward our village, taking a longer route to avoid the woods altogether. When we finally reached the village shop, out of breath and visibly shaken, we recounted the whole experience to the lady who ran the place. Her response only deepened the mystery. She assured us there was no house anywhere near the railway line, except for a railway cottage located much farther down, nowhere near the clearing we had seen. Our parents didn't believe us either. No one did. Over time, people dismissed our story as childish imagination, but my friend and I stopped taking that pathway altogether. To this day, 51 years later, the memory lingers like a vivid dream I know was real. We both saw it. There's no doubt in my mind. I'm sharing this because I wonder if anyone else has ever experienced something similar. This wasn't an isolated incident for me. Decades later, in December 2022, something equally unexplainable happened while I was traveling. I had driven to Fresno from my home in the Monterey Bay area to pick up a car I'd purchased. Although I usually took the northern route for such trips, for reasons I can't explain, I decided to head south this time. My 2 companions, Maria and her husband Daniel, accompanied me as passengers. We left at 8 p.m., and despite the late hour, I felt wide awake and unusually alert. As we traveled along Highway 145, about 3/4 of the way there, something caught my eye on the roadside. At first glance, I thought it was a dog, so I instinctively eased off the gas. But as I got a better look, it became clear this was no ordinary animal, or any animal I'd ever encountered. It was moving on all 4s but had no solid form. Its edges were blurry and hard to define, as though it were made of shadows or smoke. Its shape vaguely resembled that of a monkey in motion. But even that comparison doesn't feel entirely accurate. The figure started atop a small hill, beside the road, and then darted diagonally toward us before keeping pace with our truck as it ran, alongside us for several seconds. Suddenly it veered right across the road in front of our vehicle, forcing me to hit the brakes hard. Though I didn't come to a complete stop, I slowed considerably before continuing forward. The tension in the truck was palpable. Breaking the silence, I turned to Maria beside me and asked if she had seen it too. Her eyes were wide with fear as she nodded. Daniel chimed in almost immediately. They had both seen it as well, but were just as baffled as I was about what it could have been. When I asked if they thought it was real, they shook their heads in disbelief but didn't seem convinced either way. The incident left us shaken, but we pressed on since we were nearing our destination. And stopping on that desolate stretch of road felt like an even worse option. But then came another inexplicable moment. I eased off the gas and asked Maria if she thought there was enough room to maneuver around it. From where we were, though, she couldn't say. As we inched closer, I was hit with an overwhelming sense that we shouldn't push forward. I couldn't pinpoint exactly why, but the feeling was strong enough to make me trust my instincts. Coupled with what had already happened earlier on the highway, I made up my mind to turn back. I steered us onto Highway 145, retraced our route and rejoined the main road. The rest of the drive passed without incident. However, later on when I checked my Google Maps history to retrace where we'd been, I found nothing. No record of the trip at all. My location history spans back years, yet that specific journey was missing. It didn't make sense since I knew I'd made the drive. After all, the car was now sitting in our driveway. But there was no trace of it in the GPS logs. I've gone over and over the events trying to make sense of what we experienced, but none of the pieces fit together neatly. What gets me most is that all three of us saw and experienced the exact same things. The trip itself began under strained circumstances. My great-aunt had recently passed, and I had arranged some time off to attend her funeral. My husband and I planned a straightforward drive from Colorado to northeast Texas, with a route cutting through Kansas and Oklahoma. Things fell apart not long after we left the city and got on the interstate. First, our car battery failed while we were mid-journey. Even with the battery dying for some inexplicable reason, the car alarm blared relentlessly, and it wouldn't stop. After pulling off the road to replace the battery, the alarm continued to sound non-stop as we drove until we eventually pulled a fuse to silence it somewhere in Kansas. With that crisis resolved, we opted to avoid toll roads as much as possible and only stopped once for a quick lunch. From there, everything seemed uneventful until we reached Tulsa. As we passed through, the car's interior light suddenly turned on and wouldn't shut off no matter what we tried. Once again, our only solution was pulling another fuse to kill it. By this point it was night, about 9:30, and darkness had fully settled as we entered the toll roads heading toward Texas. What caught us off guard was learning these particular tolls were cash only. We managed to pay the first one by stopping at a nearby gas station to break a $20 bill, but after clearing a few booths, we ran out of cash entirely. At the next station, we didn't have enough to pay, and the attendant told us we either had to take a 20-mile detour to find an ATM or risk being flagged for non-payment, possibly drawing the attention of state troopers further down the line. We followed her suggested detour, but when we arrived at the gas station, she directed us to it was already closed for the night. There was nowhere else nearby to withdraw money at that hour. Adding to our stress, the car began acting up yet again. It would sputter out every time we started it unless we kept our foot on the gas pedal. We figured out how to keep it running, but it added so much tension to an already trying situation. At this point, unwilling to face another toll booth empty-handed, we decided to chance driving along back roads that roughly paralleled the toll route. These roads were narrow, unpaved, and full of rough patches, hardly ideal for a vehicle on its last legs. We followed what directions we could piece together, and eventually found ourselves looking for a side path called Jumbo Road. When we finally saw the sign for it, alarm bells went off in my head. The sign didn't look official at all. It was painted on what appeared to be a flimsy scrap of poster board. The lettering was streaked and uneven, almost as if someone had rushed through painting it without letting it dry properly, and the damp air didn't help matters either. Still, with no better options, we turned onto Jumbo Road. Something about that road wasn't right from the start. As we moved down its dark, rugged path, our headlights picked up glints of animal eyes, reflecting back at us from either side of the road. The silence only deepened the unease. Moments later, a dog appeared out of nowhere and darted into our path. I hit the brakes hard and expected it to move aside, but instead of dodging us, it veered toward the car and snapped viciously at the tires. Our path. I hit the brakes hard and expected it to move aside, but instead of dodging us, it veered toward the car and snapped viciously at the tires. Startled, I pressed down on the accelerator to get past it. Not long after that encounter came another dog, this one much larger than the first. Its size was alarming. Its head nearly reached our window level as it raced alongside the car. Language. Driving down a remote dirt road late at night, our car barely clinging to life, we found ourselves surrounded by nothing but scattered, indistinct properties on the horizon. The road seemed endless, but eventually it led us back toward the interstate. Once we merged onto a main road and crossed into Texas, we were still about an hour away from the hotel my mom had booked. By 1 a.m., a dense fog descended, reducing visibility to a nerve-wracking minimum. The small winding highway we traveled became treacherous, and we narrowly avoided several collisions with other vehicles. When we finally arrived at the hotel around 1:30, it felt like every possible complication had hit us during the trip. At the time, none of it seemed related, just a series of stressful events making for one of the most nerve-wracking drives I'd ever experienced. Years earlier, when I was around 17, I had another unsettling experience. Two friends, Chris and Jake, and I decided to camp in a grassy field next to the housing estate where I lived. It wasn't an official campsite, just a quiet hill away from nearby houses where we could hang out undisturbed. The spot was secluded enough that nobody was likely to stumble upon us without actively looking. We pitched a small tent, brought some drinks, and stayed up well into the evening, enjoying the sense of freedom. By the time night fell completely, Chris and Jake had drifted off to sleep inside the tent, but I couldn't settle down. I lay awake, surrounded by quiet darkness, trying to relax. It must have been close to 3 a.m. when I suddenly heard movement outside the tent, a distinct sound of footsteps crunching through the grass nearby. What unsettled me most was the abruptness. There had been no gradual approach or warning sounds in the distance. It was as if someone or something had simply materialized. My first thought was that it must be the farmer who owned the land. That alone was unnerving since we weren't supposed to be camping there, but there was something inexplicably more eerie about it. I froze in place, holding my breath to avoid making a sound. Moments later, I heard lighter, irregular footfalls circling outside, unmistakably those of a dog. They were different from the human steps, which moved back and forth near our tent. What made it even stranger was the silence beyond those steps. No voice calling a dog, no human indication of what might be happening. Just footsteps and pacing. At one point, I saw a shadow pass over the fabric of the tent. It was large and clearly human, stretching ominously across our temporary shelter as its source moved around outside. The size of the shadow struck me as unnaturally big somehow, and despite hearing what sounded like a dog nearby, there was no second shadow to match it. The strange pacing and footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably no more than a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound faded, not in the way footsteps trail off as someone walks farther away, but as though they diminished directly into silence right where they stood. When I was sure things had quieted down, I leaned over and carefully woke Chris and Jake, whispering my concerns about someone possibly finding us and suggesting we leave immediately only got me dismissive responses. They chalked up my anxiety to sleepiness or overactive imagination. Frustrated but refusing to make further noise, I stayed wide awake while they both drifted back to sleep. Not 10 minutes later, the sounds began again. This time they didn't just come back. They gradually swelled in volume until they were exactly as they'd been before. Steady pacing footsteps outside our tent, with lighter movements mimicking those of a dog. I nudged Chris again, whispering his name with a sense of urgency that I couldn't contain. To my relief, or dread, he was already awake this time. He softly suggested I open the tent so we could check who might be outside. I moved with as much care as possible, cautiously reaching for the zipper to avoid making any noise. What should have been a quick task dragged on as I tried not to draw attention, in case someone was really right there. When I finally had it unzipped, I yanked it open, but there was no one. Both of my friends immediately got up, and we ventured out of the tent together. We were on top of a hill in an open field, providing us with a clear, unobstructed view in every direction. If someone had been lurking nearby and decided to leave, we would have definitely seen them. But the place was completely still. No people, no animals, no signs of movement anywhere. I realize how absurd it sounds when I tell this story, and I understand why my friends initially thought I must have imagined hearing footsteps. But the second time it happened, they also heard it. Even now, I'm certain there were footsteps outside that tent. What's unsettling is that I still can't explain who or what was making those sounds. This was back in 2013, during a visit to my Uncle Dave's house in a remote area of northern Colorado. The region had history dating back to the early 1800s, with many old dirt roads and historic sites dotted around, including a cemetery with graves from that era. During my stay, my cousins, Ethan, Luke, and Ryan, and I had started going on nighttime adventures to explore the area. What began as idle curiosity about ghost hunting soon became a more involved hobby. Even though we didn't fully believe in the paranormal at first, there was an abandoned house we visited once where one of us distinctly heard a voice saying, "Get out!" and someone claimed to see a figure standing in the doorway. Still, we brushed it off and continued our weekend outings to other places. But the strangest incident wasn't inside an old house. It happened during one of our late-night drives with my uncle. It was close to 2 a.m., and we were driving down an isolated dirt road about 15 minutes from the nearest town. Our route took us over a small bridge, spanning what appeared to be a fast-flowing river. On one side of the bridge stretched a vast grain field that ended at a cluster of trees roughly half a mile away. A narrow dirt path branched off from the road, weaving through the field toward the forest. Feeling curious, we decided to stop and stretch our legs for a bit. We gathered near the bridge, chatting idly and watching the water rush beneath us. At first, everything felt ordinary, peaceful even. After a while, we made our way back to the van, and that's when we saw it, a faint orange light hovering in the middle of the grain field. It was small and seemed to be floating, rhythmically bobbing up and down as it moved slowly in our direction. Given how secluded the area was with no buildings or houses nearby, we initially assumed it might be someone out checking on their property or coming to see what we were doing there. Curiosity turned to unease as we got into the van and began driving off while keeping an eye on the light. As the van rolled forward, we realized the light wasn't what we thought. It wasn't attached to any person, nor did it appear to originate from a fixed source like a vehicle or equipment. Instead, it seemed to move independently, glowing faintly, and taking on a shape that resembled a small lantern floating effortlessly above the field. Intriguingly, and alarmingly, the light mirrored our movement. When we picked up speed, it accelerated too, easily keeping pace with the van despite its strange floating nature. It wasn't long before all of us were laser-focused on trying to comprehend what we were seeing, as it seemed impossible to fit into anything logical. About a quarter mile from where we first spotted it, the van suddenly lost all power. The engine died, the headlights extinguished. They weren't just dimmed. Every single part of the vehicle's electronics went completely dead. We coasted forward in total silence as panic began to bubble under the surface of each of us. Through our windows, we could see that eerie light still closing the gap between us and it. After what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, my uncle managed to restart the van. As soon as life returned to the vehicle, he didn't hesitate. We peeled out of there as fast as possible and didn't look back. The encounter haunted us enough that about a week later, we decided to return to that same spot during daylight hours for another look around. When we arrived at the familiar bridge and stepped out of the van to survey the scene more clearly this time, something immediately caught our attention. The river below us, it wasn't moving swiftly, it didn't look like something that had just vanished recently. It seemed more like it had been gone for quite some time. We couldn't come up with an explanation for it, but after wandering around for a while, we decided to return later that night to see if anything changed. At around 1 a.m., we headed back to the same spot. The area felt noticeably different, even before anything unusual occurred. Something about the atmosphere was off. After parking near the same spot, we sat in the van for a brief moment before Ethan and I decided to take the dirt path that skirted the grain field, heading toward where we'd seen the mysterious light a week earlier. Meanwhile, the rest of the group stayed by the van. We'd been walking for a few minutes, casually chatting to keep things relaxed, when my uncle's voice broke through, calling out to us loudly and urgently. His tone made it clear he needed us to return immediately. Without hesitation, we turned around and started heading back toward the van. At that point, we were roughly a quarter of a mile away. Before we could make much progress, a loud sound erupted from the direction of the forest. It's difficult to describe, less like the noise of a known animal or any kind of machinery, and more like a deep extended roar, something completely unfamiliar to me in real life. Instinctively, as soon as we heard it, Ethan and I broke into a sprint. We didn't stop running until we reached the van and climbed inside. Still catching our breath, we shared what we'd heard. That's when my uncle revealed something chilling. He'd called us back because he saw 3 distinct lights shoot up into the sky, directly above where we were walking. After hearing this, any lingering curiosity gave way to unease. We decided to leave almost immediately. Piling back into the van, we began our drive home, trying to make sense of everything that had unfolded. It was then that we saw something on the side of the road out of the corner of our eyes. A car flipped upside down. We hadn't gotten a good look at first, so we turned around for a better view. The car's windows were shattered, but surprisingly, there wasn't much other visible damage considering it had overturned. Oddly enough, there were no other vehicles or signs of what might have caused the crash nearby. It felt eerily out of place in such an isolated area. We stepped out to inspect it and ensure nobody was hurt inside, but the car was empty, no driver or passengers anywhere in sight. Remarkably, there was still a purse inside the vehicle, which suggested the owner hadn't taken their belongings with them when they left. Confused, we searched the surrounding area for any trace of someone who might have been in the car but found nothing. It didn't make sense where they could have gone, given how remote this stretch of road was. Eventually, we decided to call the police and report the scene before continuing home. That night was far from normal for me. Sleep seemed impossible after everything that happened. Lying awake in the living room, I noticed through the window that the outdoor lights kept flickering on and off in irregular patterns. I ended up staying awake until dawn, looking back on that night and all its strange occurrences: the disappearing grain patch, the haunting roar from the forest, the unexplained lights in the sky, and the mysterious overturned car. It's hard to form a coherent explanation when all these pieces are considered together. Perhaps some of it has simple answers on its own, but as a whole, I'm not sure what to think. Speaking of strange experiences, something similar happened when I was about 8 years old, so this would have been roughly 11 years ago now, during a family vacation in Spain. We were staying at a sprawling resort near Barcelona that boasted an enormous sports complex with soccer fields, basketball courts, rugby pitches, all laid out across a vast open space and bordered by tall fences. During daylight hours, these areas buzzed with activity, as people played various sports and enjoyed themselves. But at night, everything shut down, and they locked up the perimeter tight. One evening, I stayed out playing longer than I should have with a friend whose name I can't quite remember, maybe Brian. The two of us were messing around on one of the soccer fields, taking turns shooting penalties, without really paying attention to time passing. At some point, unnoticed by us, staff locked up for the evening. The sports complex was so large that we didn't realize what had happened until we tried to leave, and discovered all the gates were locked. Initially panicked and unsure of what to do, we just stood there contemplating our options. It was already dark by then. Without the usual hustle and bustle of the day's activities, or any lights illuminating the field, the place felt strange and unsettling, so vast yet eerily lifeless. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should continue, but since the forest was right next to the resort, we assumed it wouldn't be very large and decided to press on. At first it seemed manageable. The ground was uneven and darker than we'd expected, but we kept walking in what we believed was the direction back toward the resort entrance. After about 5 minutes, we stumbled into a clearing with an old abandoned concrete structure, partially covered in graffiti. We kept our distance, but as we walked by we heard glass crunching and the faint sound of bottles shifting inside. Instinctively, we both froze. Moments later, a man emerged from the structure, staring directly at us. He spoke no words at first, just stood there with tattered clothes and an unkempt appearance that suggested he hadn't cared for himself in years. His long hair was matted, his beard scruffy, and his walk revealed a noticeable limp. Suddenly he coughed, startling someone else inside. A second man appeared, equally rugged and disheveled. They started speaking to us in fast Spanish. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but their tone was hostile. Anxiously, we began backing away. As soon as they noticed our retreat, they moved toward us faster, then broke into a run. Shouting loudly in anger, they hurled objects at us, and without a second thought we turned and sprinted. The forest was pitch black. We could barely make out what lay ahead, as we barreled through tangled roots and branches, desperate not to trip. The chaos behind us felt unending as we kept running for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, after what must have been only minutes, but felt like hours, we burst out of the trees onto a deserted road. On one side was a steep drop, on the other nothing but dense underbrush. There were no homes or people in sight. Gasping for breath, we kept running uphill, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and the men. Eventually, the road led to a large gated property. A house sat far back on the lot, its windows dark and lifeless. Deciding we had no other option, we scaled the gate and ran into the yard before hiding in a dense cluster of bushes to avoid detection. Minutes later, we heard them. The men had followed us onto the property. Their loud voices and heavy footsteps woke someone inside the house. A man emerged onto the porch shouting angrily and carrying a gun. He patrolled through the yard, coming frighteningly close to where we were hiding. Though I held my breath, I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Spotting the two men, the homeowner fired a shot into the air. One of them tried to approach him further, but stopped as the gun was aimed directly at him. The man with the gun didn't hesitate. He shouted them down and forced them off his property at gunpoint. Once they left, silence fell over the yard again. We stayed hidden in those bushes for what felt like an eternity before deciding it was safe to leave. When enough time had passed, we quietly climbed back over the gate and returned to the empty road. This time we headed downhill until we reached a small town some distance away from the resort. By now, hours had passed since our initial misadventure began. The shock was only then truly starting to set in. We approached one of the houses where lights were on inside and rang the doorbell to ask for help. The language barrier made communication awkward, but when we said the name of our resort, they pointed us toward the right road. Sticking close to buildings this time, we followed their instructions. Along the way back, we passed what appeared to be an abandoned slaughterhouse not far from the resort's grounds. Unable to resist peeking inside for just a moment, we realized to our horror that it was covered in old blood, splashed across the floors, walls, and bits of rusted equipment left behind. Even knives scattered across the room bore dried stains of red. It was not a sight we could stomach for long, so we quickly left that eerie place behind. Finally, after asking for confirmation from some Dutch travelers nearby, who also pointed us in the right direction, we made it back to the resort. To our dismay, the staff didn't recognize us and refused to let us inside at first until we explained which unit our parents were renting so they could verify. Only then were we allowed back in. By the time I returned to our room, life seemed unnervingly ordinary again. There were still pancakes on the table waiting for me to finish my earlier breakfast. I sat down with my brother and played Pokemon like nothing extraordinary had happened that night. The following day brought its own minor mishaps. My mom gave me some money for the arcade later on. My fiancé and I have always loved hiking, and over the years we've had our fair share of unusual experiences on the trails. But nothing could have prepared us for what happened a few weeks ago. We decided to go for a brief hike at a state park we've visited dozens of times before. Since it was just a quick outing before dinner, we didn't bring our usual supplies. No knives, no pepper spray. I even reassured him, saying, "It'll be fine, we've done this plenty of times." The first half of the trail was uneventful, with the woods quiet and undisturbed. But as we rounded a bend, we saw something that stopped us in our tracks. A woman standing off to the side, softly crying as though she was completely unaware of our presence. A few feet ahead of her was a man with his back toward us, pushing a stroller down a rocky path where a stroller had no reason to be. The uneven terrain made the scene even stranger. Doing our best not to attract attention, we continued walking briskly past them, avoiding direct eye contact. About 5 minutes later, we decided to turn back since hunger was setting in. As we retraced our steps, we saw the man still pushing the stroller. This time I couldn't help but glance inside out of pure curiosity, and what I saw gave me chills. It was completely empty. No baby, no blanket, nothing. Without thinking, I whispered to my fiancé, "There's no baby in there." I thought I'd spoken quietly enough not to be overheard, but apparently not. The man must have caught my words because my fiancé leaned closer seconds later and murmured in an unusually calm voice, "He's staring at us." I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the intense weight of his gaze pressing into my back. Then we heard his footsteps. He was following us, picking up speed as we quickened our pace. Every time we glanced over our shoulders, he was still there, never close enough to catch us, but always looming within sight. As we passed the crying woman again, she made no move to acknowledge us or him. The stroller he'd been pushing was now gone. At that moment, adrenaline took over and we started running. My chest felt tight, and my breaths came ragged and shallow as fear coursed through me. Each time we rounded one of the trail's sharp turns, we'd lose sight of him for just a moment, but he'd always reappear, still walking purposefully through the trees. It felt endless until finally, mercifully, we caught up with a group of other hikers ahead. The moment we joined them, the man disappeared, vanishing soundlessly into the dense woods. When we reached the parking lot, we sprinted to our car, started it without hesitation, and sped away. During the drive home, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. What if there was a baby? What if he just wanted to confront us about what I'd said? But deep down, I knew something was inherently wrong about the entire situation. Since then, I haven't returned to that particular trailhead. On occasion, I've ventured into other parts of the park, but there's always an unsettling feeling lingering in my gut, especially when I stumble across discarded baby clothes along the trails. A tiny sock here, a stained onesie there. Every time I see them, that same cold sensation creeps down my spine. I've always been drawn to exploring the outdoors. It's part of who I am. Growing up in a remote desert town with wide open spaces and little supervision meant my life revolved around wandering for miles with friends. My parents would remind me to be home by dinner, and otherwise left me to roam free. Along the way, we'd find all sorts of oddities, abandoned buildings, remnants of old equipment, and even some strange animal behavior that defied explanation. One encounter from my childhood stands out above the rest. I must have been around 11 when some friends and I wandered into the foothills near town, a trip that wasn't out of the ordinary for us back then. We were used to stumbling across random debris or decaying structures left behind by who knows who. But on that day we found something truly bizarre. A manhole cover embedded in the ground with a short concrete collar rising around it. It was far from any road or area that looked official. It just sat there alone amidst the wilderness. Curiosity got the better of us, so we decided to investigate. One of us had been carrying around a piece of rebar. It's amazing what kids will find useful, and we used it to pry off the cover. After some effort, it gave way, revealing a vertical shaft about 20 feet deep with a rusted metal ladder. The walls were covered with an array of crude drawings and symbols, including a pentagram and swastikas, hastily scrawled in marker or sprayed on with paint. Random piles of magazines and other out-of-place objects were strewn about, a stark contrast to the remote location. It didn't feel right. A cramped underground space clearly inhabited by someone, with unsettling graffiti surrounding us. The oppressive atmosphere didn't inspire curiosity. Instead, it urged us to leave, so we made a quick exit. Looking back later, I came up with a few possible explanations. The area was dotted with long-abandoned ranches and buildings, and it wasn't uncommon for local teenagers to turn spots like that into makeshift hangouts. This one might have just been a bit more hidden, being underground. On the other hand, the location was along a route often used by people traveling across the desert toward the city. It's possible it had served as a temporary refuge in the past. Whatever the case may have been, one thing was clear. It wasn't worth further investigation. Out in those parts, we'd already learned when to trust our instincts and walk away. That day, we were certain it was time to go. This experience didn't dampen my love for exploring caves, though. I'd always been drawn to caving, enough so to later join a club that planned trips and sent out monthly packets detailing various tours. Most were relatively standard but enticing nonetheless. Occasionally, they offered what were known as wildman tours, which were a step up in intensity. I'd gone on several of these before, challenging but manageable adventures requiring some climbing or maybe a bit of rappelling, but nothing truly extreme. Then one month, the club's packet featured a longer wildman tour that immediately caught my attention. This one promised to be much more technical and physically taxing, scheduled to last 7 to 8 hours. The description didn't shy away from the risks. Narrow passages where taking the wrong line could leave you stuck, precarious sections where a single misstep could send you plummeting into unseen depths. It also emphasized the challenges of performing rescues in such conditions. If something went wrong, help wouldn't be quick to arrive. Even so, I was intrigued and signed up. When the day arrived, I discovered the group was small, just 3 guides myself, and another participant named Alex. From the start, this trip carried a weighty sense of seriousness. that I hadn't felt on previous tours. The guides seemed particularly meticulous about our movements and kept a close eye on every handhold and foothold. The terrain demanded it, sharp descents along uneven rock faces and passages that narrowed to the point where you had to carefully contort your body to squeeze through. About halfway into the journey, we came to a stop on a thin ledge that clung to the edge of a vast drop, plunging into darkness. Even with our headlamps at full brightness, the bottom was nowhere in sight, a void that seemed infinite. As we rested, one of the guides, Mark, mentioned something they sometimes did with larger groups, a total darkness demonstration. He explained that in other caves, they would have everyone turn off their lights momentarily to experience what absolute darkness felt like. Although it was just Alex and me on this particular tour, we both agreed to try it. When the headlamps clicked off, the transition was instant and profound. True darkness enveloped us completely. There was no gradual adjustment for your eyes, like there is during a moonless night above ground. It was not just dark, it was absent itself, a void where sight ceased to exist completely. No shapes, no movement. Nothing at all could be seen in that abyss. A complete absence of light surrounded us, an impenetrable darkness. We stood there quietly for about 30 seconds before a sound broke the silence. At first it resembled footsteps echoing somewhere in the cave, not right next to us, but not far away either. This was quickly followed by what seemed to be loose rocks, shifting or tumbling down. Then came an eerie, drawn-out screeching noise that echoed unnaturally throughout the cavern, as if it were something sharp and metallic, scraping deeply against the stone walls. Immediately, the lead guide switched his headlamp back on, and as his beam illuminated the space, I caught sight of his expression. It was one of genuine concern. His initial reaction seemed to be fear. Perhaps someone had fallen from one of the ledges. But he quickly confirmed Alex and I were still there, then turned to the other two guides and asked if they had heard the sounds too. They had. None of us could identify the source or explain what had happened. The situation felt strange, almost unsettling. The lead guide reached for his radio and contacted the surface team, asking if there were any other groups inside the cave system, or if anyone had gone missing along the route we were on. However, given how deep we had ventured, several hours into the trail, it was unlikely anyone else could have made it this far without proper equipment or guidance. After several minutes of waiting and listening, during which no further sounds occurred, the eerie silence returned. Following a brief discussion between the guides, they offered our group an option. We could stop the tour and head back if we didn't feel comfortable continuing further. They even promised a refund if we decided against proceeding. After considering it carefully, we opted to push ahead and complete the tour. The rest of the expedition proved uneventful. No unusual noises disturbed our path, and nothing out of place caught our attention. Yet even now I find myself unable to shake the memory of what we heard. I've tried reasoning through it. Perhaps it was rocks shifting deeper within the cave, or possibly echoes distorted through the cavern's acoustics, making them sound closer or stranger than they really were. But that specific sequence, the footsteps followed by the falling rocks and that disturbing screeching, hasn't aligned with anything I've ever encountered before. The guides admitted they couldn't explain it either. It remains the only time I've been underground and heard something that defied immediate understanding. Another peculiar memory comes to mind from years earlier, involving my grandparents. After retiring, they settled in southern Idaho near a little town called Potterkello, surrounded by acres of farmland. The land stretched out peacefully with only a few neighboring properties here and there, some with milk cows, others with horses, and by the river bottom occasionally wandered elegant whooping cranes. Trees were sparse except for an aging apple orchard near their house. Interstate 15 ran close to their place, passing through that quiet countryside with modest traffic compared to busier highways. However, what made that portion of road memorable was the terrain. Nearby lay ancient lava fields composed of jagged black boulders, sharp-edged formations you wouldn't want to brush up against, let alone crash into at speed. When constructing the highway there, workers cleared much of the lava rock away. Still, some larger remnants remained scattered in the median between the northbound and southbound lanes, looming ominously with their razor-like edges, capable of serious harm in an accident. I once had a conversation with my mother, about driving through that area during a visit to their farm. It was something she brought up casually while we were chatting about road trips in general. Though she didn't say much more at the time, that kind of landscape sticks in your memory, just like moments of inexplicable mystery inside a seemingly silent cave system. Both leave behind questions you might never find satisfactory answers to, but linger nonetheless as fragments in your story. She warned me to be extra cautious on that particular stretch of road, delivering her advice with unusual seriousness. I remember telling her that I was already a careful driver and had no plans to veer off the road. Keep in mind, this was well before cell phones became common driving distractions, so her concern seemed a bit exaggerated at the time. But she didn't let it go. She mentioned that there had been a series of accidents along that stretch, incidents where drivers lost control and crashed without any other vehicles involved or witnesses present. According to her, many of these crashes ended tragically, especially when vehicles collided with the sharp lava rocks in the median. Then she shared a chilling account from one survivor of these mysterious accidents. She explained how this person claimed to have swerved after being startled by what he saw, a figure standing in the median. The figure appeared to be on horseback, adorned with what the witness described as a fully feathered headdress. This startling sight caused him to lose focus and ultimately crash. Trying to rationalize it, I asked if she thought it was just someone in a costume. She shook her head and said no. According to local law, people believed it was a ghost. I didn't know how to respond to that. It sounded like one of those eerie tales that circulates in rural areas, especially in places with a rich, storied history tied to the land. But what stuck with me was the way she recounted it. It didn't feel like just another tall tale to her. Since then, every time I've driven through that area, her words come back to me. Not that I expect to see anything myself, but I can't help but think about it. Hey everyone, it's Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Apologies if I sounded a bit off in today's video. Honestly, I'm dealing with what people sometimes call vocal fatigue. My throat's not in great shape at the moment, so my voice might not be at its best. An extra special thank you goes out to my members and patrons. You can see your names displayed on screen as a small token of my appreciation for your continued support. You truly make keeping this channel going possible, and I can't thank you enough. I'll be back tomorrow with another video for you all, and this one is going to feature cabin stories, always a favorite. If you can't wait until then and want some spooky cabin stories now, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where you'll find my podcast, Mort's Bedtime Stories. Believe it or not, we're already on episode 92. It's incredible how far we've come together. Take care, everyone. I'll speak to you soon. Have a great night.